And my name is Lorne Robinson, and I get to serve as the National Director for Kingdom Advisors in Canada. And as part of my story, I guess, or my experiences, I get to speak to financial professionals all across the country. And I've felt that it's so important that many of the stories that I hear, it would be great if you could also hear them. And that's part of the reason I've started to do these Kingdom Advisors webinars, and so that you can experience other Canadian financial professionals and some of the experiences that they have also had. So as part of that, I just wanted to share just a little bit, because Kingdom Advisors is really a community of financial professionals. And we meet on a regular basis, consistently, through study groups. That's one of the means. And if you're interested in learning more about Kingdom Advisors, I would really suggest that you tap into a study group. And a few years ago, we had maybe less than a dozen people attending study groups in Canada, if you go back 5 or 6 years. And today we have a minimum of 60 and upwards to 80 and 85 Kingdom Advisors meeting on a monthly basis to discuss biblical wisdom around finances and how you can incorporate that into your practice. The beautiful thing about study groups as well is it's recognized in the industry. It's a way that you can continue to develop professionally. We have continuing education credits that are approved by FP Canada and Advocate, or the Institute. So I would encourage you to join one of those study groups and to participate. And you can find out more just by going to kingdomadvisors.com/study groups. Or you can just message me, lorne.robinson@kingdomadvisors.com, and I'll certainly direct you to one. We have about 16 or 18 study groups that meet on a monthly basis. They're all virtual now, so it's a great opportunity to connect. My guest today actually has been in a study group fairly consistently, but the topic of last month's study group was serving widows. And we tend to focus on all kinds of different topics, but our goal is to incorporate biblical wisdom into the advice that financial professionals share. And I was not planning to do a webcast over this summer, to be honest, because it is summer and I want everyone to enjoy their summer and not have to be on another webcast. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. But with our content being around serving widows, I just felt compelled to have my guest on today to share her story, because it's extremely powerful. And I'm going to call her Amie U, and she's given me the permission to do that because she says with her kids, when they receive awards, everyone tends to struggle pronouncing her surname. Me being from Newfoundland, it's always a challenge with names and so on. So I'm just going with Amie U today. So welcome, Amie, to the program. And I think we may have been having some technical difficulties, and hopefully there we are. Amie, welcome today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, that's great. And by the way, you are new to the financial services industry, fairly new. Mm-hmm. And you are the first person, I think, that I've had on as a guest that I don't believe we've actually met in person. We've chatted online several times. We've met virtually and had some conversations and connected really through LinkedIn. So hopefully in the near future, as the restrictions lift, and I believe they are lifting in Alberta, or are lifted in Alberta. So maybe we'll be able to get together one day soon in person.
That would be so nice. That would be nice.
So as we get started, Amie, I'd just love for you to tell a little bit of your background. And your story is definitely a compelling one and a challenging one when it comes to being a widow so young. So first of all, I'd love for you to share a little bit of a background. And my understanding is you married your high school sweetheart. So just kind of tell us a little bit about that as we start here.
Yeah, we were from Ontario. We actually both grew up there. We lived pretty close, like just a couple blocks away from each other. And high school sweethearts, and we decided we wanted to move to Alberta. And so we did. He was actually enrolled for the Army, and we were waiting for him to be deployed. And instead of that, he was getting bored. So he decided to help out a plumber in Fort McMurray. And then he ended up loving it. And so we moved to Fort McMurray. And I had Alana, who was 1, and I was pregnant with Cody. And so needless to say, he's like, nope, come on up. We're going to move here. And I'm like, okay. And we put everything in a moving truck, and our vehicle went in a train, and off we went.
Mm-hmm. So how many years ago was that?
Oh, goodness. Alana is 17. So that would be 16 years ago. We moved to Alberta, and we've never looked back. We loved it. We did migrate south because, of course, Fort McMurray back then was booming, and to afford housing there, that wasn't going to happen. So we kind of moved to Lacombe and then Bentley, and we started a plumbing company of our own. And then we actually moved to an acreage, and we built our dream home. And that's when everything fell apart. That was so 8 years ago. And
yeah, everything seemed to be fairly normal, I guess, from your perspective. A young couple, married, you had 3 young kids, and then you said, yeah, everything fell apart. So tell us a little bit about that and how that happened, actually.
Oh, goodness. Living on the acreage, and my husband was about to turn 30. And so because 30 is such a big deal, and he's worked so hard for the company, and we always said that, after 5 years, he was going to slow down and spend more time with the family. He's like, age 30, that's age 30, that's going to be 30. And I'm like, okay. So I trudged through it, him being so busy. And his 30th birthday present was him going to Vegas with his friends on his motorcycle. And so my mom flew down from Ontario to stay with us and help out with the kids. And he never came home. And all of a sudden, you get a phone call, and you don't expect it, and your whole life shatters in an instant. And then you're trying to figure out how to go on, how to pick up all of these pieces, and when I say shattered, I'm not saying just pieces on the floor. I'm like talking dust particles. Like, that's how shattered it was. We never seen it coming. It was devastating. I was working like casually just to try to help out, and so I could have some work experience when the kids were off to school. And how many years, but really no education, no background, more of a stay-at-home mom than anything. And all of a sudden, he's gone. His income's gone instantly. The mortgage wasn't covered. We sold the house. Oh, it was over the phone, and it was the same day that it was listed, and we were out 2 months later. All because we didn't have a plan.
So you basically had no insurance, or not enough insurance in place to cover off what was obviously not planned. It was just completely unexpected. Can you tell me, or tell us a little bit more about the phone call that you had, and basically how you cope with that after, like in the immediate days after?
Yeah. Oh, you know what, Lorne? And I was telling this story to you not that long ago, that I was out shopping with my mom, and my son was at a hockey tournament. And so my youngest was 3, and Alana, and there's my son in the background, but he was at a hockey tournament. And then Alana and Monica were in the car with me, and we were pulling into the Walmart, or their London Drugs, by the south end of Red Deer. And so we're by London Drugs, and my phone's ringing, and it comes to Bluetooth, and she's like, ma'am, can you talk right now? And I'm like, yeah. And it's the Vegas police. And she's like, I need you to pull over. And I was like, okay. So I pulled into almost like a handicap spot in London Drugs. And I will never shop there again. Like, I don't even go to that parking lot. Like, I can't even be in that vicinity. It's negative for me, and it brings back a whole bunch of things. And even for my friend as well. it was going between Bluetooth, and I remember jumping out of the car and I was holding my phone, and it kept going back and forth between the car and my cell phone, and I'm like panicking because I'm like, oh my goodness, my kids are in the car, my mom's in the car, my mom can see my face, I'm falling apart, I'm crying, I'm like, and then the lady's telling us all this stuff, and I'm like, no, you've got the wrong person. Like, you don't have my husband. No, you don't. Like, that's no. I didn't believe it. And I remember that I got off the phone and then we drove to Walmart because I was meeting my friend there. And my mom had to drive the car, and I got out of the car, and all of a sudden my friend, we parked right in front of Walmart by the doors there, just so that way we would meet my friend, because the parking lot's so big. And I fell apart. I fell down to the ground. I couldn't stand up. My friend was holding me. And of course, people start coming, and I don't remember much. I actually don't remember much of my first year, right? It was just also, it happened all so fast. And I guess to try to make sense of it all, it's really hard still. To this day, it's really hard.
It's interesting, Amie, because when we did our study group, one of the comments or the questions from last month's group was on, how do you deal with a widow, from an emotional perspective? And I think many times financial advisors, they're not necessarily the first on the scene to help. Many times it's a member of the clergy that's there to do that. But financial professionals do certainly have an opportunity to step in the midst of that grief and that loss. So I'm just wondering, having gone through it, what would you say, what advice would you have for a financial professional particularly, or even a friend when it comes to that matter, if you're dealing with someone who has just been widowed? And the bad news is, statistically, 80% of men will go first. So not good news for the men on the call, but women will be basically remaining. And what advice would you give to a professional to deal with somebody who's grieving, especially in the early going?
Yeah. We talk about it all the time, and what I expected and what I got were two very different things. And I guess you really don't know what you expect, right? But I anticipated that I would have had a lot of people be there and support me and help me. And I will own the fact that I've always said I was fine, and I did push people away, but there's such a big disconnect. And I would say the biggest thing is to show up. If somebody's saying, no, we're fine, we're good, we've got it, show up anyways, be there, and say to them, you know what, you've got this, and this to do. I can do these two things, you can do that. Do you have a certain way of doing it, or am I good to roll however I roll it? And I think just knowing that somebody's willing to do those things for you is huge. I had a friend that made us some teddy bears and a quilt and some pillows out of his clothing. That was a saving grace for us. It was a way for me as a mom to gauge where my kids were. So if the teddy bear, for example, was up in the closet, I knew that they were struggling. If they were cuddling with it, it told the story, right? So every single time that I would notice a pillow or a teddy bear was not on their bed, something was going on with their emotions, and we had to talk about it. And so having those little things, not all of us are capable of sewing, but find somebody who can sew and make a pillow, make a teddy bear. Now going forward, anybody who passes away, I make them teddy bears out of the clothing, because it's such a huge heartwarming thing. And at times, I put my teddy bears away, and times it comes out again, but that's grieving. It's never consistent. I remember people would come up to me, and I lived in a smaller town in Delburn, right? And everybody would come up and they would tilt their head and they'd be like, are you okay? And every part of me wanted to go to their head and straighten it out and say, stop asking me if I'm okay. No, what do you think? I'm not going to be okay. My husband died. Right. But it's an automatic response, which we need to start changing that and be more aware of what we're saying and how our body language is as well. And, sometimes I just needed somebody to share space with me. I didn't need to say a word. I just needed them to be in my same space. And we didn't have a financial planner, or, I was that stay-at-home mom that didn't have her own bank account, that didn't have her own credit card. Everything was absolutely, completely joint. So he's gone. And all of a sudden the bank is like, well, ma'am, you now need to apply for this, this, and this. And I have no credit score and I don't have a job, right? So I don't really have
Mm.
anything. And I wasn't educated on that. Nobody told me that's what I needed like prior. And so these conversations need to be had now, not later.
So practically, that's, you bring up some good points about credit score, establishing your own credit, and a lot of people may not be aware that your credit as a spouse was entirely, it sounds like, based on your spouse's. You didn't have your own.
Yeah.
So I think
No, it was all
the
joint.
importance of, and so establishing your own credit. So that means, I guess, having a credit card in your own name.
Mm-hmm.
There's some importance even in doing that, so that it's developing a credit score for you.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, also knowing, and I don't know who dealt with the finances, if you did or if he did. But yeah, tell us a little bit about the financial repercussions of his death.
Oh, goodness. Because the acreage sold so fast and there really wasn't a plan, I opened up the shop and it was like, okay, guys, we had a big auction, and not even an auction, more like a big garage sale where we opened up the shop, and that's the acreage right there. We had a wonderful lady that lived in the community that said, hey, before you move, I want to get pictures. And I was like, no, we're good. We're not doing that. And she's like, you're going to want these later. And I didn't believe her, but she was right. Bless her heart. But we had to say goodbye to the acreage. And so we opened up the shop and had to clear out, and people kind of just came in and offered whatever. And I took it because I really didn't know what some of the stuff was worth. Hindsight, had I had somebody walk me through that, I would have maybe been able to sell the company, not just liquidate everything and just kind of close it out. But it all happened so fast. Like, his bike was gone, his truck was gone, all of it, because I didn't have any other way of doing it. We had to get rid of the horse. So Alana's saying bye to the horse, right? You sell an acreage. I moved to town, and all of a sudden we had a dog, we had cats, we had a horse, and we had to say goodbye to all of it. And grieving what we thought our life would look like is a horrible thing. Now, whether that's a death or whether that's a divorce or an illness, it doesn't matter. Grieving what you thought your life would look like is so real. And my kids grieve that all the time. Like, poor Miss Monty couldn't understand it. That's Monica, my youngest. And she didn't understand. She's like, what's going on? And I posted a video on LinkedIn not that long ago. I was actually back in Delburn, and I was sitting at the driveway, the end of the driveway, back in the same position where the 3 kids were in the backseat of the car, and we were pretty much driving away to what we thought our life would look like in the rearview mirror. All because we were naive and had that mentality that it's not going to happen to us. We're going to be okay. We almost thought we were invincible, right?
Yeah, and I think your story is so impactful, and our stories are meant to impact. And life sometimes throws us a complete curveball. This is not something you saw coming, and things come at us sometimes in life. And I think it's really our job as financial professionals to help prepare. But without a story, sometimes people are not necessarily compelled to prepare. Can you comment a little bit on that from your own experience? Yeah.
It is. It's true. The funny thing is we had an advisor that looked at us and said, you guys need more insurance. And my husband's like, okay. Let's look at some prices. And sure enough, he was a smoker. And so the guy's like, okay, well, it's smoking rates. And we all know that smoking rates are doubled, if not more. And my husband's like, oh, wait, I'll wait till I quit smoking. We'll be okay. And then never did, never got there. Right. So when people sit in my office and they're like, oh, well, we can't afford that, or we don't have the money for that, or maybe we're going to wait till we're a non-smoker. I'm like, well, let me tell you a little bit of a story because I lived it. Right? Do you want your life to look like this? Do you know what the aftermath looks like? Do you know what kids grieving is like? Do you know what, your life shattering and having to rebuild yourself? My daughter, she wrote something, and I shared this with Lorne last week. This is her words. I remember as a child wondering why the other children would not invite my siblings and me to their houses or to play tag on the playgrounds. It was as if one touch and their families would be gone as well. We were looked upon with pity, with fear, as though our destiny was already paved out because of our environment. We couldn't control the death of our father, but here we were expected to pay the price of his absence. However, instead of growing weak or letting them get us down, our mother said, keep your chin up. There's nothing wrong with being an outflict. She said that our circumstances do not define us. And with that, we vowed that we would continue on. And, you know, when I read her writing, she pours everything into it because that's how she grieves. But the hurt that's in that, because it's almost like we were contagious. You know, people fall off. They don't know how to talk to you. They don't know how to be there for you. Your friends change. You know, all of a sudden you're a widow, and it's like you have to rebuild your connections. And I don't even know how to explain the aftermath of, you know, the nightmares and the night terrors and, you know, meltdowns in grocery stores, when my daughter would see, you know, another daddy holding his little girl, or, you know, giving somebody a piggyback ride, and all of a sudden she would lose her mind. You know, she would be swimming in a pool and talk about how her daddy's in the ocean and she just needs to go find him. You know, and the kids sometimes would make up almost like a story that he was gone to work, and I'm like, no, he's not coming back. But our bodies go into almost like a survivor mode, like an autopilot. You know, I don't remember my first year. Well, there's lots of things that the kids don't remember either, and it comes up over the years. They say year 1 is hard. I say year 3 and 5 are horrible. You know, and this year was year 8, and I struggled. You know, and you think it's going to get easier. It's different. I wouldn't say it gets easier. It just gets different. And you have to constantly, there's always moving parts. So it's always changing. There's certain triggers that can come up that you're not even aware of. And so if we're going to be there for widows, we need to create safe space to talk about these things.
And you know, you bring up a valuable point. It's just not you. It's like part of your coping is having to deal with your children. You know, the challenges even in school, being in school, and having to grieve through that at the same time. When this happened, your children were at what age?
3, 7, and 9.
Yeah. And a complete shock to you and your daughter. I wanted to draw attention. I was going to draw attention to what she had written as well, because to me it's extremely powerful and it speaks very much about purpose in life. And I want to ask you a little bit about that as well. And she writes, every time I look in the mirror, I wonder, am I more than a result of my environment? Was I doomed or privileged because I just happened to be born at the right time in the right place? Is the beauty of who I am affected by how I grew up? In many ways, yes, but light shines despite one's circumstances. And she quotes Tupac. I assume that's how you pronounce that name, but it says, just because a rose bloomed in concrete doesn't make it any less remarkable. And I would say it actually makes it probably even a little bit more remarkable because of where it grew. The rose defied the odds it had been given. It bloomed in a place that probably needed it more. And when I read that sentence, it's like life throws us some curveballs sometimes, you know, and it's just like out of the blue, we're brought into a place where we never dreamed it even possible that we would find ourselves. But in the midst of all that, we just have to trust that God is working out his purposes. And I wonder if you could speak to that. Now you're beyond 8 years, lots of challenging times in that. But I kind of see you, Amie, as a rose rising from the concrete, and almost an impossible place to be. And she says this: the reason we thrive is because of the ability to rise above the circumstantial difficulty that we are given and achieve our goals, even though we are told that they are impossible for us to reach for someone from our origin. We thrive on what we have been given. We persevere in the face of adversity. And that is what shapes us. It is not the difficulty that makes us the way we are, but how we deal with it. And such powerful words from your daughter. And I believe it's because you have instilled courage in her. So you've entered the financial services industry, which I kind of think is moving you toward your purpose through a very difficult circumstance. Can you speak a little bit to that?
I sure can. I want to go back a little bit and talk about how, I didn't have faith back then, and we blamed God and we were angry and it was hard. I remember laying in bed and not being able to move, and my body was sore. I actually don't remember how my kids got to school, and that sounds horrible, but I remember hearing little patter footprints, and it was Monica, and she got to my bed and she's eye level and she's looking at me and she's like, Mommy, are you going to die next? And oh my goodness, and she had this big crocodile tear coming down her eye, and I jumped out of that bed so fast. And that's when I realized, and that's the moment that I was like, okay, you know what? We can't fall into what that stat looks like. We can't, okay, there's time for grieving, but we also need to, I always say I had to pull up my big girl panties, and I had to figure this out. I had to still be a mom to 3 beautiful kids. And, we decided that we wanted to move away from Central Alberta because it was just really hard to be in his shadow. He was a big personality. And so we just felt like we were always the widow and the kids were orphans, and we just wanted to move away. So we moved to Medicine Hat to get away from our story, to come here and to be almost like a mother of 3 kids, right? No one really knew our story. And I found faith in all of this, and God got me through it. And it's because God carried me for my first year. And then when he decided to put me down, I told him to pick me back up again, because I was like, I'm not ready yet. and needless to say, it was at that moment that I realized too, you know what? I have a story. We have to use it. And as hard as it is, people need to hear it. And, so then I got into the financial industry. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago where I actually fully shared everything. And my daughter looks and she goes, Mom, what are you doing? We moved 4 hours away to get away from our identity, from that story. And I was like, baby girl, that's not our identity. We need to share this because people need to hear this, because in life, our stories, our journeys, the good, bad, and the ugly. And trust me, I did a lot of things that weren't, good or wrong or whatever. You do what you do, and you do the best that you can. But it becomes a manual for somebody else who's maybe grieving what they thought their life would look like, whether it's a death or whether it is a divorce, or maybe it's just, maybe they lost their job and they're grieving that. Maybe they're grieving, their health all of a sudden being taken away and they can't do the things that they thought they could. Grieving is grieving. There's so many different levels to it, but it's real no matter how you look at it. And so being able to speak to people and, share and have that vulnerability to say, hey, I get that. It's important to feel like we're not alone. And when we share our stories, that's when other people can be like, you know what? I'm not in this alone. They get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's interesting. You talk about grieving, I guess, what your life was to look like. And I'd like for you to explore that a little deeper, because I think all of us at some point, and that means all of our clients at some point, end up grieving what they thought their life was going to be. And it didn't turn out exactly like that. So that sort of grieving, it may not be to the level of loss that you experience, but I think a lot of people experience loss in life. It may not even be death, but it's a loss of someone or a loss of something. Maybe it's even a career that's lost. There are so many things that I think we can help others with. So I don't know if you'd like to respond to that.
It's funny. Is sometimes we feel like we're actually robbed. Somebody robbed us. And when I look at it and I think, okay, I really loved being a stay-at-home mom. Like I loved it. And I'm not the same mom that I am now that I was then. And that's actually sad because I was that mom that would sit down and read with them and sing them songs and do crafts. One of the things that I really do grieve is I had every intention. I have 3 kids, so of course, when the other 2 were in school, I had every intention with Monica that I was going to be able to volunteer at the school and be there. And I had no little babies at home anymore, so I was going to be that mom that was constantly going to be on the parent board, and helping out. And I feel like I was robbed of that. Alana talks about being robbed because her dad doesn't get to see her graduate. Her dad doesn't get her, like, she just bought her first car on Friday and she got into tears because she's like, Mom, Dad's not seeing this. And I was like, oh, babe, he's watching you and he's proud. But we feel so robbed in that sense that we were robbed of those moments, right? Those moments. And that is why it's so important for us to realize that time should be viewed as currency, and that the world has it backwards. And so when we, help families and individuals and businesses, we need to help them to realize that time is currency, that you need to capture those moments and to stop chasing the money and to be present and to show up and to feel and, to kind of like, and then give yourself, this is the thing, I need to give myself compassion and grace that, yes, I'm not the same mom that I was, and that is okay because I'm different, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that was a really, and still is a really hard thing for me.
There's a few comments that have come in. James is saying, thank you for your courage to share your story and insights. Colleen, says such a harsh life overall. I'm sorry you and your kids went through this, and so glad you had support people. And I think support people have come into your life. Ruby says, thanks for sharing. Great and powerful words indeed. And I would encourage anybody who's watching us today, if you have a question that you'd like to pose to Amie, challenging as it might be, feel free to share it. Ryan says time is currency. And I think that is a very impactful insight that we all need to be considering. And Joy says this, it doesn't get easier, it just gets different. And you really referenced that. Your life is different now than it was. And I also have heard you quote, what the enemy meant for evil, the Lord has turned it around for good. And I'd love for you to share some of that, because it's a devastating story. When I heard your story and as we've reviewed it together, it's a devastating and challenging story. Yet in the midst of it, there is hope. So I'd love for you to share even a little bit about that verse.
That song, it's actually a song, though it's what the enemy meant for evil, God turns it to good. It's called the Victory Song. And I heard it in church one time, and I was like, oh my goodness, I was moved. And I mean, like, my hands were up and I was crying, and I was like, okay, and when I was reading a devotion the other day, it talked about how God also grieves with us. And I actually never thought that. Like, and I don't know why, I just never thought that God was grieving it as well, and that he was hurting because I was hurting. And when I was reading some stuff, I was like, oh my goodness, he's a God that loves us, and he hurts with us, and he feels our pain. And what the enemy meant for evil, like this isn't necessarily God's plan, but definitely the enemy, if we even look at COVID or anything, the enemy comes in and tries to steal our joy and our happiness. But God can turn it to good. He uses it, but he only uses it if you let him use it. And that is one thing that we've really had to lean in and trust that, okay, God, you've got this plan. You're going to use us in some way. Okay, here you go. And that's that surrendering what I thought my life would look like, and been like, okay, here's my life. Do with it what you may.
Yeah. And, back to the time is currency. It's, how do you spend your time? And like, what's your advice now in regards to finances? And I love your idea that you mentioned earlier about even hiring somebody to sew something together for someone who is is grieving. And I'd like for you to share a little bit more of your experience around doing that yourself for people that you have come in contact with who have lost a loved one. And how significant is that?
Oh, goodness. So, I do it quite a bit, and it's sad that I do it quite a bit, but the kids kind of, and because, we were widowed and, we kind of went through that, sometimes we have awkward humor, and I won't lie. And so I would come home with random shirts, and my poor kids were like, Mom, you have another guy's shirt again. And I'm like, oh, I know. And we have to make more teddy bears. And I would stay up. And I am one of those people that I don't want to wait to get it done. I want to do the bear right away because I want them to have it right away. And Medicine Hat has had a lot of hurt lately. And so there was a lot of loss. And so one was really young and he had 2 kids. And so they brought me 2 plaid shirts, and I made 2 teddy bears, one for the daughter and one for the son. And they were young, like they were, I think, 7 and 9, around my kids' ages. So it really hit me home. And it was really hard for me to, and this wasn't even my client, this was somebody else's client. And I just honestly, randomly, I asked the advisor, can I call them? Can I reach out? And I did. And I was like, this is going to sound like the weirdest thing ever, but I was hoping that I could make you some teddy bears with the shirts that he used to wear, his favorite ones that the kids love. And the lady was like, and it was the grandma, because the grandma was the one, or the son's mom. So it wasn't the wife, it was the mom. And she's like, oh my goodness, that would be wonderful. And so she brought me some shirts, and sure enough, I come home and I make the teddy bears. And then there was a concert going on in Medicine Hat. And I said to her, I'm like, you know what? You might want those teddy bears for the concert because it gives the kids something to hold. So I told her to swing by the house and pick them up because they were all done. And she got on my front steps and she looked at me and I looked at her. I'm like, me too. And I just hugged her and we both cried. And she's like, okay, I gotta stop crying. I'm like, it's okay. You can cry. It's okay, because we were both crying. And I gave her the teddy bears. And the teddy bears are really cute because the pattern of the shirt is on the paws and the hands and, the little heart, and they are really cute. And then I would get little buttons that were for the girls and for the boys, and their little noses, and their ears had the dad's pattern as well. And so we gave them to her, and they're not perfect teddy bears. I'm not a great sewer, but you know what? I still showed up. I still did it. And she had brought me a gift and a thank you card. And she didn't want me to open the thank you card until after she had left, but it was so big. And I still hold on to the little beautiful crystal ornament that she gave me, and it hangs in my kitchen, and it reminds me all the time that, you know what, there's light and darkness, and we just need to be there. And, the kids got the teddy bears, and I explained to her, I'm like, you know what, if she needs to call me, let her call me. Here's my number anytime. And I explained a little bit about how kids grieve differently than adults. And that sometimes you're going to see that teddy bear or that pillow put up in the closet. Sometimes it's going to be under the bed. Sometimes they're going to want to hit it. Sometimes they're going to hold it, and it's all okay. And so she's like, oh, because I at first thought that was wrong, like that my kids were putting it up high and hiding it. I'm like, why is he doing that? I couldn't understand it. And it took a friend to explain it to me. And I was like, oh, so then I had to learn. And this is that whole, we share our manuals, right? So by me sharing with her that, she was able to then give that advice to the mom and, walk her kids through that a little bit. It's not easy, but.
Yeah. Because of your experience, you're able to come alongside someone who's grieving a lot more readily than someone who hasn't experienced that to the same degree. So I'm just wondering what you would say to an advisor who struggles a little bit, I guess, in a circumstance like that with the loss of a loved one, when typically the conversation is centered around finances and the financial loss. Yeah. Maybe it's the comfort of financially you're going to be okay, and leaving off the emotional part. I just wondering how you balance both, the financial and the emotional when you're working, when you're talking with someone and ministering to someone.
I think it's important to have, and as I'm talking, I'm actually thinking about this is something I want to create as a checklist of, okay, well, what would a widow need to make sure they've got all figured out? And the other area I think that is so important for us to to check in and just say, hey, I want to hear a story. Tell me a story about, your loved one. Like, what is the craziest thing that they've done that drove you nuts? Right. And so I would ask people that, and because it's a little bit funny, and like, okay, did he leave his socks laying around? Like, did he leave his dishes? Or did she do this? And kind of get them so that they're sharing, because then all of a sudden their guard goes down as well, because they're sharing. And then just say, this is a safe space for laughter, for tears, for anger. It doesn't matter. It's, my kids would laugh because they're like, Mom, you need like Kleenexes by bulk. And I'm like, that's okay. And so my husband hated family photos, and I made him get photos at the acreage. And so he was quite bitter. So we were more so horsing around versus being staged to get the photos done by a friend of ours at the acreage. So.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So back to the planning side of it. I'd love to have your thoughts on how would you share your story? I guess you would share it similar to how you shared it today, maybe, but picture yourself in a client meeting, and I've been there, where I'm trying to encourage them. So the example that you gave on the insurance side, well, non-smoker rates versus smoker rates. You need the coverage. It doesn't matter if you're a smoker or a non-smoker, you need the coverage. How can your story be shared in such a way that it compels them to purchase? Not necessarily you sell them an insurance product, but it really compels them to purchase. What would you say?
We're not in the business of selling. We are actually in the business of storytelling. Now, use my story, find other stories. We all know people within our circles that have devastating things happen to them. Maybe they have a critical illness. Maybe they, had somebody pass away. We all know people within our network. And so it's really about tapping into those stories and sharing them and making them real. So when I'm sitting with people, I would be, and it depends on the person, right? I would definitely be like, oh, you think you just need mortgage coverage? Okay. Have you thought about income replacement? Because if something happens to him, he's gone instantly, which means the money stops instantly. There's no more money coming in. And I'm a straight shooter. I say it how it is. I'm very blunt and to the point. And maybe because my story helps back it up a little bit. But I really stress to people, and if it's something else and it's my story doesn't resonate, but it's all of a sudden, somebody, really needs critical illness and they don't have it and they have everything else. I'm really going to speak to, a story. Well, do you know somebody within your network of friends or your community where they've had to use a GoFundMe page to cover an illness? We see it all far too often. And why is that? Well, it's because we're not planning. So we need to plan. So what does this look like? And I always go back to the whole home and auto thing. If your auto insurance goes up $50 per month, are you going to pay it? You're going to be grumpy and you're going to shop around. But if the whole industry goes up, guess what? You're paying it. And what is so frustrating for me is that home and auto insurance is mandatory. But isn't your life worth far more than that? And it's not mandatory, and you don't feel like you should be to covering it properly? And so I think just having those real conversations and giving real examples as to what the aftermath looks like, whether it's life or critical illness or disability, anything, just giving real life examples, speaking to those moments and sharing. And I believe we need to do more collaborating in the industry. We all know of people, and we all have our own testimonies. We need to be sharing more often and using that with one another to spur one another on. And oh my goodness, I went to this family's house. They had just had a baby and they have 3 kids, and they were young kids. And I sat at the kitchen table, and the husband had his headset on and he was playing video games, and he refused to even acknowledge my existence. And so the wife really, really wanted the coverage, but she couldn't convince him. He wouldn't pay attention to me. And I laughed, and I was like, oh my goodness, like, whew, okay. I followed up a whole bunch of times, still nope. It wasn't until 3 months later that all of a sudden on Facebook, he had passed away. And my heart sunk. I walked into my manager's office and I was bawling. And I'm like, what could I have done differently to to have sold them a policy that they needed, because now he's gone and they've got nothing. And I reached out to her and she wouldn't respond. She wouldn't respond. I kept reaching out to her. And finally, she agreed to meet with me. And we were both in tears. And I went into her house, and her kids were the same age, actually younger than my kids were. And it was so real because I felt like I was reliving it. And she was in tears, and so was I. And I looked at her, I'm like, oh my goodness, what could I have done differently? And I asked her, because you know what? I'm human. Was there something that I could have done differently that would have helped you? And you know what she said to me? She looked at me, she goes, you did everything you could. He wouldn't listen. She goes, it's going to be okay. I'm like, oh, okay. And we still remain friends. We still talk on a regular basis. And the cool thing about this story is, remember, what the enemy meant for evil, God turns it to good. And guess what she's doing? She's becoming an advisor. She passed all of her life insurance tickets. And so I am super proud of her, because she's going to now use her story to help others as well.
It's interesting, the verse in Proverbs 20, verse 5, that talks about the purpose in a person's heart is like deep waters. And I have changed the next part of that to say an advisor of understanding will draw it out. So it's kind of, what's the purpose of what has happened to you? There's got to be some purpose in it. I believe there is a divine purpose for all of our lives. Yeah. And in the midst of the devastation of loss, you can't kind of see that purpose. It's so challenging. It's so difficult. But I think that's where we need to be advisors of understanding, who will understand where a client is, even in that circumstance. And that story that you just told is powerful, because it's very similar to your own story, where you have, become a financial professional in order to live out, I believe, what is God's purpose for your life. So, I think even negative things, bad things happening to you can lead to a greater purpose and actually living out a calling that's on your life. And I think that's the very powerful piece that I think we need to be communicating to our clients. And just a comment.
Anything else.
Yeah. And Ed has made this comment: I'm confident that your willingness to share with us today will significantly impact others with whom we will now be able to share your story. May our Father bless you and your children in a very special way today. So I think that's very heartfelt. And I think most people on this call very much feel the same way.
And I say it over and over and over again: create a space that is safe for people to share, and that let them know you welcome it, and show up. Always show up. And showing up can look different and for so many different things, but always just show up, whether it's a phone call, an email, in person, a note, a handwritten note goes a long way. The teddy bears. Even if somebody pushes you away, press in, because we're only pushing you away because we're hurting and we don't know how to do it. And we don't want to ask for help because it gives us a feeling of we're being weak, or we don't want to burden somebody else, or we don't want to have the pity. So show up, and we're never going to turn you away.
I was going to ask a quick question about how quickly you should engage with this person, because I know one of the hesitancies is, okay, I know this death just occurred. I don't want to intrude. But how quickly do you feel as a financial professional you should make contact, reach out with
you
this
bring a meal right away.
Individual?
Bring a meal right away. You cannot go wrong with meals at all. I didn't like flowers, because flowers for me were, flowers die, and it just made me think of death. And so when people brought me meals, or they brought me cookies, or they brought me craft stuff for the kids to occupy the kids, those were things that were really important. So it depends on obviously the age of people, but if you got a young family and there's kids, bring over sidewalk chalk, bring over balloons, bring over coloring books, different things that can occupy the kids, because you're doing so much stuff that you need some help kind of entertaining them a little bit. And so, or meals, freezer meals are great. You can freeze them. You're not worrying about them. I would make sure that they don't have to give a dish back to you, because, you gather a lot of dishes, you don't know whose they are. And then you have that burden almost that feels heavy, where you have to bring all the dishes back, or you feel guilty if you don't. So I would suggest doing a frozen meal that's in a container you don't have to bring back. And I would do it right away. There's nothing wrong with that. Getting a card, and maybe not knocking on the door, but putting it in their slot saying, I'm thinking of you, you're on my heart. Right? And maybe that's when you put a little note in there saying, I would love to make you some teddy bears, or I would love to make you a pillow, or, you can get little quilts right now. You can get with a cross inside of it that you can put in your pocket. And whenever you're stressed, you can hold on to this little quilt that has a cross, something like that, or a little prayer card that's, in the card, and dropping it off. I think that you want to know that someone's there. And because so many other people fall off, you as the advisor need to show up over and over and over and over again, because they're going to have all these other people that they never thought would fall off. It's crazy. It's like they're dropping off like flies, people. I'm not joking. Like it's death is a weird thing. And so if you can be that one constant person that's either showing up with a meal, or showing up with crafts, or showing up with a card, or a phone call, or an email, I touched base with that lady, oh my goodness, once a week for a long, long time, until it took her the courage to say, hey, I'm ready to meet with you. And I knew how she was feeling, because I was the same way. I kept pushing people away.
And I think that's a key point, to understand that it's natural, I guess, for people who are grieving to push people away. And therefore, when you're pushed away, you just say, okay, I'll leave them alone. And really what you're saying is not push back, but keep going back and being that friend at that time. I think that's just some very practical advice from someone who has been there. And I want to say, Amie, that I really appreciate your vulnerability today to share your story. It's a powerful one. And I want to wish you all the success in your career as a financial professional, because you're starting out brand new. And I just pray that the Lord would open up doors for you to share your story, that you are impactful, not just to have success in this business, because it's not just about success and the numbers, but to have success in a way that really, really ministers to people. So thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. Completeness. So you've truly become a kingdom advisor, and you're ministering as much as you are doing the business, in the midst of doing God's business, I guess is the key point. We need to do God's business in the midst of doing business. And too many times we leave God's business parked on the doorstep because we want to do the business. We want to close the deal. The important thing is to do his business in the midst of doing business.
I had for my first year, actually, when I was a financial planner, I all of a sudden had a lot of widows show up in my office, and it was the weirdest thing. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is definitely divine intervention, And I had it where this lady comes in and she's thinking she needs insurance, and she's sitting there and she's a recent widow. And I'm like, oh, hun, I'm like, you're not here for insurance. I'm like, you're here because you have a heaviness on your shoulders and you need prayer. And for me, it was really like, that was really me stepping out and saying that, because that wasn't my norm. And all of a sudden, the tears that came down her face, and I was like, oh, and at that point, two things were going on, right? I was like, oh my goodness, good, I heard God right. And the second thing was like, oh dear, the heaviness. I all of a sudden felt the heaviness. And so praying over her was pretty amazing. And at the end, she goes, how did you know? I'm like, he just made that known. And so when we're meeting with people, we have to be so open and so not in our own heads, and not even in the financial realm in a way. Like, we need to be very aware as to, why are they in my office? Are they in here because they need something? Are they in here because of something else? And I think that sometimes it can be both, and sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other, and you just never know. And so I think that having that openness to know that it could be, God can bring you a whole bunch of different things, and you need to be aware of what he's trying to do and how he's trying to work through you.
Yeah, I think that willingness to be open to be used of the Lord, even in the gifts of the Spirit. And I think too often we have limited the use of the gifts that God has given to us to operate within the church building instead of in our business lives. So I think, looking at the opportunity to share spiritually with our clients in ministry to them is a significant piece of what we do. And it's not new to those who have been around Kingdom Advisors for sure, but there are many Christians who are in the financial services industry that kind of leave their faith at the door and they just do business, when God is calling us to really do his business and do his bidding and to be used by the Spirit. So I really appreciate you sharing that today. That's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Powerful story. And I think the Lord is going to continue to use you in a big way. Would you close us out in prayer, Amie?
Yes. Absolutely. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for gathering all these people. Although I can't see them, Lord, I know they're there. And thank you for bringing them forth and compelling them to listen and hear our stories. And Lord, I just pray that you will work in each and every one of us, and that, you know, Lord, what our hearts are feeling and where we're at. And I just pray that you will stir something new in us. And each and every one of us, that you'll stir something new and you'll light a fire within us. And all of a sudden it's going to spur something, Lord. And I just pray that we start to realize that these are little seeds. And sometimes we're just planting, and we may not see the harvest for a while, Lord, but there's going to be a harvest. And we know that because you are fruitful, you are faithful, Lord, and that you're going to bring that to fruition. So I just pray, Lord, that all these people listening, Lord, that you will bless them with good health, bless them with wisdom and knowledge, Lord, and bless their path and open doors. And I pray that you will bring people to them that they can minister to, Lord. Give us the courage, though, as financial advisors, that we will have the courage to share so openly and boldly and beautifully, Lord, and that we will be aware as to whether somebody's heart is opened or closed. And Lord, we will just gauge that really well. And I just pray that you will bless all of us in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again, Amie. Appreciate you telling your story. For all of you who joined, I again apologize for the technical issues that we've had. I trust the recording will be much better, and I will be sharing the recording on social media as well. So spread the word. It's a powerful message. I pray that each of you will have a wonderful summer. This is the last webcast we're going to do until the fall. So I really appreciate you being here. Thanks so much. God bless you all.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.